In the spirit of spooky season, I thought it would be quite fitting to build some Night Trooper helmets. I mean, 'tis the season for reanimated corpses, am I right? No, but seriously, I love the Kitsungi style of the Night Troopers, and I've always wanted to make the rest of the collection to go with my Enoch helmet. I decided to use my Kidi +4 for both of these helmets. They were a bit tall for the printer, so I split the main body of the helmet so that it would fit. And I of course also printed these pieces in ABS. You know I'm an ABS fiend. It is a million times easier to post-process, which you will see in this video. The Death Trooper also seemed a bit small at 100% scale compared to the Stormtrooper, so I increased it to 115% as that seemed to be a bit more in line size-wise. But that did also mean that I needed to split this helmet as well to fit on this printer. Not a big deal, honestly. This probably ended up working for the best as it meant that I could minimize some of the support material that the pieces would need. And once again, these pieces were printed in ABS, although gray ABS this time because apparently I have no black ABS in my collection right now. Once I had everything printed and the supports removed, I started off by filing down some of the more rough edges. This tended to be where the support material was. But after that, I did really want to end up putting these two halves of the Death Trooper together. I'd already done it for the Stormtrooper, but I first started with some of my acetone and ABS slurry mixture to help smooth out the underneath part of the visor brim section. It was a little rough and liney. It is where support was holding it up, so it just was not as smooth as other sections. So I first smoothed some of that out while it was still a separate piece, but then I did in fact go ahead and attach these two parts together. I used just MEK for this. I find that it really dissolves and attacks the ABS faster than acetone. Acetone will still definitely work for attaching ABS parts together though, and I'm still constantly sort of experimenting and figuring out what I like the most for my work. After I let the two pieces dry, I guess for lack of a better word, or just solidify into a single piece, I did go in with more of my acetone slurry mixture to start smoothing out some more of these areas, just anywhere where there's more obvious layer lines, like on the top of a dome. I know everyone's gonna start yelling in the comments about adaptive layer heights. I've tried it, it does help a little, but I'm still gonna have to do this process anyway, so it's honestly not worth the added print time. And I went and did the same process with the acetone slurry mixture on the Stormtrooper helmet. I know it does seem like kind of a crazy concept to work on two helmets in one video, but honestly it was kind of just the perfect setup because both of them involved pretty much the exact same steps, and when I was having to wait for one of them to dry, it meant that I could go back to working on the other one. So very efficient, and it meant that I could check off both helmets off of my to-build list. After I'd let the acetone slurry mixture dry, evaporate, whatever you'd want to call it, I of course had to go in with my handy dandy foot sander. Now this is actually where I ended up losing a member of the team. Very sadly, one of my foot sanders died on me during the sanding process of this helmet, but at this point I own like 6 of them, so I just picked up the next one. Now on ABS helmets like these, I spend absolutely ages on this initial sand. ABS is just so easy to sand, and when I can do it with the foot sander, it's just a whole lot more convenient and easy. So each one of these helmets I probably spend like an hour on with the foot sander to try and get out as many possible layer lines as I can, and then I will go back into the more difficult areas with generally 100 grit sandpaper. After I got that first round of sanding completed, I decided to go in with a layer of filler primer, mostly as just like a seeing coat. I wanted to see how smooth these helmets were after that sand, if there were any areas that I was going to need to spend more time on other than that really obvious and ugly seam on both of them where the two main parts attach. And I was pleasantly surprised to see that even after the one coat of filler primer, they were both looking pretty overall layer line free. On the Stormtrooper helmet though, I did kind of completely forget that there were ears that were supposed to get attached to this. So I did that first, sanded off the filler primer that was where the ears needed to go, just so that when I added the acetone, I didn't have a filler primer mixture mess on my hands. Once I'd let that dry and sit for a bit, it was on to getting rid of those nasty seams with some body filler. Now, I have a love-hate relationship with this stuff. It is the most ideal thing to be using with those really intense gaps gaps and seams that you can have on pieces. It's a two-part system, so, you know, it hardens up really nicely. This is the fast drying version of it, which I think sometimes is my problem, although I am generally impatient, so the 15-minute dry time does honestly probably work the best for me, and here I am also using it to fill in the seams of the ears. But I don't know, this stuff, it just always seems like more of a pain than it's worth, or there's just like so many other products that I would prefer to use, even though that I know this stuff should be what I'm using to fill in those larger gaps. But literally in this video, the seam line at the front of this Stormtrooper helmet, this stuff, even though for all intents and purposes should have filled in that gap perfectly, flawlessly, you would never know it was there, it did not do it. It left a very obvious seam line still for like half of it, and so I had to go in with what I generally would have done anyway had I not bothered pulling this body filler out. So yeah, I'm trying to like it. I'm trying to do the most professional method possible, but I still need to warm up to the body filler. The one nice thing though is that it does quite literally dry in 15 minutes, so it is super fast to go from applying it, sanding it, and then being able to go straight into priming and, you know, filling in with whatever method I need to do next. In this case, of course, more filler primer because I just blow through this stuff like it's water. But here is where you can see that very obvious line still, especially on this helmet. You could also see it with the Death Trooper, but we're going in with the good old Bondo spot putty and some EVA foam, since this was quite a curved surface, so maybe I should have tried to use the EVA foam with the body filler and it might have gone better. But as the name of the spot putty would suggest, I'm just going over any spots that look like they need a bit more filling in, a bit more work, and then once that's dried, going in and sanding all of that off again. This time 180 grit sandpaper, I find that anything harsher just tears the spot putty apart way too much and just creates gouges all over all of the surfaces that you just worked on. But now onto the special fun step that goes into these Night Trooper helmets, dremeling out all of the cracks. Yes, these helmets do already have the cracks in them, but between my sanding and the filler priming, they do obviously lose some of their depth, and this is also just generally for authenticity purposes. The actual helmets had dremeled cracks in them, and so I have just always decided to take the extra step of going over and properly dremeling in all of these lines. It does also give me the chance to add more lines if I want, or just make any adjustments that I might see fit to make this particular helmet more customized, especially, well, actually with both of them, but especially the Stormtroopers. There are so many variations for this helmet that there really is no like wrong placement of any of these cracks, so it could have been even more fun maybe if I had just made like a standard Stormtrooper and then just fully put in any of the cracks that I wanted in the different spots. But having those cracks already printed into the helmet is definitely super helpful as a guide, even if I do decide to go in and add more of my own. This does still have a practical purpose because I find that the dremeled cracks, you will typically go a lot deeper than the printed ones ever can. It will not get sliced in as deep as you would probably get with this Dremel, and it makes it a lot easier to apply the gold leaf later on, so highly recommend dremeling the cracks even if you do not necessarily care about the authenticity of having dremeled cracks into your helmet. It just makes life a lot easier when you go to add gold leaf or do any of the gold line work that we are going to be doing on these helmets. For the Death Trooper, there were some additional detail pieces that I resin printed that I wanted to now go ahead and attach to the helmet. The Death Trooper really is just that one black glossy color, so I wanted to have these detail pieces already on the helmet so that when I go to start painting this, it will just all match really nicely. Once I had all of those cracks drilled in and those additional pieces added, I went ahead and did a couple of rounds of filler primer on both of those helmets. I hadn't actually done any filler priming in between adding that spot putty and then doing the cracks, so I was pleasantly surprised to see that these helmets were looking absolutely beautifully smooth and very layer line free. So I did the final step that I do before doing any painting, and that's just going over everything with some 400 grit sandpaper, mostly to just knock off any possible overspray so that I have the smoothest possible surface for painting. And in terms of painting, both of these helmets are pretty straightforward. I mean, the Death Trooper is just going to be a glossy black. This paint was technically satin black. I honestly kind of didn't care what finish it was because I'm going to be clear coating this anyway, but I had some satin black laying around apparently, so I figured might as well use that. Same thing goes for the Stormtrooper. I had some satin, or I think it was actually semi-gloss, technically white, laying around open, so I figured might as well just use some of that up. Normally I use matte paint, so I'm not actually sure why I have this in my collection, but the next and technically final step for this outdoor painting process at least was this Montana gloss varnish. Now this stuff is not 2K clear coat, but it's honestly not half bad, all things considering, like just how easy it is to use. I did a couple of coats on each helmet. On the can it does say to do a few fine coats, but I typically do a couple of quite wet coats and I get that really nice flawless glossy finish. But the reason I love this stuff so much is there is absolutely nothing tacky about it. It is not sticky in the slightest, which is incredibly important for what we are about to do to these helmets with the gold leaf. But before we get to that step, for the Stormtrooper, there were a couple of things that I still had to paint. I masked off this upper brim stripe. I don't know what on earth this is called. This is actually the first Stormtrooper that I have ever built, which is quite crazy considering all of the other insane things that I've made. But this upper band needs to be black. So I just airbrushed on some more satin finish black paint. You can see I was really paranoid with the masking for this helmet since I did not want to accidentally get any of this black anywhere it was not supposed to be. And I'm happy to report it was a successful masking job. I then went in and masked even more off because I decided that I wanted my particular Stormtrooper helmet to have more of the gray patches area design. I don't know. Anyway, I'm using the paint that I have clearly, as I've labeled, determined to be Enoch Gray. It's what I used on my version 2.0 Enoch helmet that I really had to knock out of the park in terms of accuracy considering where this helmet was going. I still need to make myself a new Enoch helmet using all of the new and improved tricks and techniques. So of course I was going to have to make these Night Troopers match in preparation for whenever I get a chance to actually do that. As I've mentioned, there's just so many variations for the Stormtrooper Night Troopers, and I always really liked the look of the ones that had more of this gray design on them, so I knew I was going to have to make mine with a decent amount of gray on it. While I still had the mouth taped up, I went in with some black paint to darken up this recessed area around the teeth of the helmet, I guess we will call these. The mouth vents appear to be darker, so painted these areas black while I still had that tape to hopefully keep my lines nice and sharp. But once that was done, I went ahead and removed all of the masking tape from around this mouth section to, again, thankfully see for the most part a pretty clean line. Did have to do a few touch-ups, but really not that bad. But now onto the part of these helmets that makes them so incredible yet so tedious, the gold leafing process. I would say this is a lot more time consuming than it is difficult, and it can also get kind of messy. I kind of can't believe that I've elected to do gold leafing again after possibly finally just cleaning up all of the excess gold leaf from the last times that I've used it. I hate a clean workshop, I guess, but here I'm applying the leafing adhesive. This stuff goes on like water. It looks like nothing on this white helmet. It has a slight blue tint to it. It is completely non-tacky. You let it sit for generally about half an hour, and then it turns into like the stickiest stuff on earth that you can then start to apply the gold leaf to. The leaf are these incredibly thin sheets that really will just rip apart in your hands if you're not careful. So you will see me use a combination of various brushes and a sponge brush to try and apply this to the helmet and also get it into all of the crevices of the cracks and just generally remove any excess and try and not waste it and move it onto other parts of the helmet. For any of the larger areas, I would say you definitely want to be using a full sheet for those. The full sheet is where you will end up having the most reflectivity. The cracks, though, you can pretty much just fill up with any little bits that you have that are excess from around those larger pieces or that are flaking all over your desk creating a mess. But for the best effect, I say use a full sheet for those larger areas. If it is something like Enoch and you have to do multiple sheets, just try and get them as smooth as possible because that is where you end up with the best reflectivity reflectivity of the gold leaf. This is where the Dremeled cracks come in super handy because it's just a lot easier to put that leafing adhesive into those deeper cracks, and then you have a very clean line to then be applying this leaf. Like, there really was not a lot of excess of adhesive on any of these cracked areas. It was all condensed within the crack itself, so it made it really easy to apply and push in the excess leaf and just get these cracks full of that gold leaf looking really sharp against the rest of the helmet. For this, I did do one helmet at a time because you do have that half-hour window in terms of when this adhesive starts to become tacky, and there are a lot more cracks on the Death Trooper helmet compared to the Stormtrooper, so it just seemed like the best idea to stick to one at a time. The adhesive was really easy to see on this Death Trooper. You can clearly see in the footage how blue this stuff is compared to the black, so this was a lot of fun to do and also pretty easy to tell where I had already applied the adhesive and where I hadn't, as long as I could generally remember where it was in the cracks, because when it did start to dry it turned completely translucent. But once that adhesive had set for the half an hour, again, it varies depending on the type of adhesive. The kit that I've been using just has that half-hour benchmark. I will link the kit that I've used below, although I have started using different gold leaf that is more of a pale neutral gold because I feel it's a more screen accurate color compared to the one that comes in the kit. I know I sort of briefly mentioned the texture of the clear coat for these helmets, but this really is where it is very important that you use something that there is absolutely no stickiness or tackiness that's like a residual feature of whatever clear coat you're using, because this leaf will stick to absolutely everything, especially when you are flaking it off. It is a problem that I encountered the first Enoch helmet that I made that thankfully I was able to solve by using this clear coat on the version 2. But when you see me brushing all of this excess leaf off of this helmet, it is really more static that is making it cling to the helmet, because the second that I take a damp paper towel to it, it all just wipes off beautifully and you're left with the gold leaf only where you want it. After I let the adhesive dry for a bit, I do go in with the varnish that's provided in the kit, and I only bother to go over the large sections on the helmets. Gold leaf is just a very thin and delicate material that I could see very easily getting scratched, but the cracks, they're pretty protected just because they are more recessed. If you were making these for wear use, I would say 2K spray the entire thing and maybe not even bother with the varnish. But after I let that dried, it was on to some weathering. For the Death Trooper, I used a combination of some acrylic paint, some Fuller's Earth, and some matte medium to mix in with the powder to create real mud and dirt sort of effect. This was actually pretty fun since I haven't done any dirty weathering on a completely black helmet in a while ever. The last one that I kind of did was Merrick's, but that was more rust. So the challenge of having an all black helmet and needing to add a little bit of weathering just to give it some more life and so that it didn't look so pristine was fun. And the final steps to finishing off this Death Trooper were creating a visor. I put in a piece of cardstock to the visor area. It's a flat visor, it's quite simple. I gave myself a vague template, cut even further around that so that I gave myself a decent area that I could be gluing into the helmet, traced this template onto a welding visor that had a nice green tint to it. You will see why this is important later on. Cut that out and then just glued it into the helmet. This was actually a very easy visor installation. The slightly more complex part were these mic tips. These were the only parts that I left separate from the rest of the helmet because inside I wanted to put another small piece of that welding visor as well as some of this LED foam. This stuff was developed specifically for cosplay to help diffuse LED lights within costumes. It's absolutely awesome stuff, and when used in this way and with some green LED lights, you get these really cool looking light up mic tips. And that was pretty much it for the Death Trooper, but back to the Stormtrooper, there were some additional small parts that I needed to paint both black as well as the same gray that I used for the rest of the helmet. It was actually incredibly convenient to have these panel pieces be separate, so it meant that I could airbrush on this gray color instead of hand painting it on like I would do all the time on Enoch. And once all of those parts had dried, it meant that I could start installing them on the helmet itself. I just used some super glue for all of these parts. Really nothing special to say about this particular part of the process. Well, actually, I did also add the blue stripes, but I did that off camera because my hands, a glue gun, and a camera fitting inside of the helmet just does not work, unfortunately. But those were also separate pieces that got added on. Once I got everything attached, I realized that I never had gone and painted this section of the earpiece gray, so went in with a brush and just got that finished, on both sides of course. And once that had all dried, it meant it was on to weathering. Now, thanks to this not being a solid black helmet, it meant that I could go back to using what is probably my favorite weathering technique, and that is the dirty paint water in an airbrush. Instead of applying any sort of acrylic wash with a brush, it's just so much easier and gives a better effect, in my opinion, if you use an airbrush to spray it on. So I generally use a combination of some sort of like homemade black wash. Sometimes I will add in some more acrylic paint and then some additional water to water it down, of course, depending on whatever I'm painting in particular. So for this helmet, I kept it more of a super neutral black-brown. At first, it was like much too warm for my liking, so I added more black into the mixture to tone it down a bit. Weathering on Stormtroopers tends to be leaning more towards black than brown. And all I do, as you've seen me here, is spray on that mixture quite heavily and then blot it off with a paper towel, occasionally sometimes also spritzing more water onto the surface if I want to remove and thin out that sprayed area even further. This helmet in particular was interesting considering there's quite a lot of textures going on it, like the glossy white surface is taking on this weathering different than the gray is, which is completely different than the gold leaf is. In fact, the gold leaf really doesn't take on any of the weathering, so you really don't ever have to be concerned about the gold looking too messy or anything. But yeah, even though it looks insane, spraying this on quite heavily and wet does actually work better in the long run because it's a lot easier to blot off than if you're spraying it quite conservatively, because it will pretty much already be dry by the time you get to put your airbrush down and then start trying to blot it off. So I do a pass of this weathering pretty much completely over the helmet, but I do go back and concentrate into more of those recessed areas and areas that probably do build up more of that weathering, like around the ears, any of those crevices. Yeah, the dirty water with an airbrush is just a pretty foolproof and easy weathering method if you're looking for one. And the last thing this helmet needs are some lenses. So I resin printed these mold pieces, basically is what I'm going to call it, and I'm going to take a piece of that same welding visor that I used for the Death Trooper. I use these in pretty much every single helmet I make, and with a heat gun start heating up and softening that piece of visor. And once you feel it's soft enough, you take the outer part of the mold and just press that down, creating yourself some nice bubble lenses for a Stormtrooper. Not the fanciest setup, but it does work, especially if you're just making random one-off pieces. The resin that I used to create the mold parts wasn't a whole lot. I use resin because it is a lot more heat resistant than any of the plastic, and I figured I would just warp out of place and also even possibly stick to the hot visor, so resin is probably the best way to go for these. And once they've cooled down a bit, I just trim any of the excess material that's around the lens, giving myself a little so that I can actually attach them into the helmet. And yeah, that's how I make molded lenses for helmets. The final touches for the Stormtrooper helmet included putting this mesh screen behind the mouth vents. I also added it to the mic tips. Again, both of those things are just very impossible for me to film well, given that I'm having to stick everything within the helmet. Same thing goes for these lenses. Everything just got hot glued into place, so really nothing fancy. But the final step that I took for this Night Trooper helmet was going in and painting the recessed panel details on some of these gray pieces black. And here are the final Night Trooper helmets. Now, I did decide to stick a green light into the helmets when taking this footage. I didn't decide to do this more permanently because the green glow in the eyes only happens to these troopers when they are the reanimated corpse versions, but other than that, their helmet visors do remain neutral, normal, like the typical Stormtrooper and Death Trooper, and they just have those Night Trooper cracked Kitsungi elements, so that is why I did not have these green lenses be a permanent feature. But for photos and the sake of this video, having that green glow was super cool, and I'm glad I did manage to figure out a way to make the visors look nice and evenly greenly lit. But these helmets do still look really cool even without the glowing visors. Thank you for joining me for the process of adding these Night Trooper helmets to my collection, and I will see you in the next video.